when you're playing very, very deep stack, because really you have a lot of options available. It's very different than when you're playing 20 big blind poker in a poker tournament where really you only have 1 or 2 viable options in a lot of spots and you're not doing a whole lot of mixing. Here, the solver does do a ton of mixing, and that's what makes deep stacked games difficult, right? Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerCoaching.com, here with another hand from the 200-400 Cadillac of No Limit Hold'em race between Daniel Negreanu and Doug Polk. They're competing to see who the driver of the car is going to be. Today we're playing with 8-7 of hearts on the button for Doug Polk. Certainly a good, strong hand. He raises it up. Daniel Negreanu with Jack-9 offsuit makes the easy call. Nothing really to see here. Flop comes 10-8-3. Negreanu checks. Doug Polk checks behind. A lot of people think, nothing to see here. But there's actually a lot to see here. Let's take a look at the GTO strategy for Doug Polk on the flop. Daniel Negreanu should check basically every time from out of position. So what should Doug Polk do? Take a look at this strategy. Notice how almost every hand is played using some amount of bets and some amount of checks. Notice like ace-queen on this board. Checks about half the time and bets about half the time. The green is check, the light red is bet small, 33% pot. The dark red is bet 75% pot. Let's navigate over here to 8-7 suited, and we see that 8-7 suited bets big about 15% of the time, bets small about 70% of the time, and checks about 15% of the time. Compare that to 8-7 offsuit with no backdoor flush draw. This is mostly the backdoor flush draws that are betting, I have to presume. But with no backdoor flush draw, it mostly checks and bets only occasionally. So how in the world is Doug Polk supposed to know this and remember this? And the answer is maybe he does. I know I certainly don't. I don't think many people know. All right, in this scenario, 8-7, we do these exact frequencies. It's very, very difficult to know this type of thing. Let's take a look at this. Notice he does not have the backdoor flush draw, though. And like I said, if you don't have the backdoor flush draw, this is the one that probably is opting to check a little bit more often than the others. So pretty cool to see that Doug Polk is very likely playing relatively close, if not perfect GTO strategy in this scenario. It is interesting to note that like 9-8 offsuit, though, compare 8-7 offsuit to 9-8 offsuit, right? And, you know, to be fair, the well, take a look. We'll just look at this, right? Not 8-7 offsuit, no backdoor flush draw, does a whole lot of checking, probably about 80% of the time. Whereas 9-8 offsuit does less checking. It checks, call it 70% of the time or 65% of the time. Compare that to 8-7 suited. 8-7 suited only checks about 15% of the time, but 9-8 suited checks about half the time, right? These types of things are very counterintuitive and very difficult for us mere humans to figure out, right? Because it's kind of neat to see that 8-7 suited bets more than 8-7 offsuit, but 9-8 suited, well, proportionally it's a little bit off, right? Like there's more 9-8 offsuits than 8-7 offsuits, but there's more 8-7 suiteds than 9-8 suiteds. It's confusing, right? And these GTO strategies are very confusing. So you want to do your best to develop rules to some extent that apply in the vast majority of scenarios. And I'm sure Doug Polk has studied this type of thing a lot, and he probably recognizes on this board, he probably knows stuff like middle pairs should all check sometimes, and the times they want to check are typically when they don't have a backdoor flush draw. You may say, but if you don't have a backdoor flush draw, shouldn't you be betting more often to try to make your opponent fold? First things first, no one's holding a backdoor flush draw, but also when you have a backdoor flush draw, when you bet and get raised, you're going to be able to easily continue on a lot more turns when you get a backdoor flush draw, right? When you improve to flush draw on the turn. So you don't really mind making the pot bigger with that hand because it has a little bit more equity than with no backdoor draw. Anyway, neat spot. Does go check, check this time. Turn brings the literal nuts for Daniel Negreanu, and he gets tricky and trappy and goes for a check. What do you think about this? What do you think the solver is going to say here? Solver says with Jack-9, you should actually be betting the majority of the time. I'm not going to say always, but the majority of the time. And take a look at these incredibly mixed strategies for Daniel Negreanu. We gave the solver 4 options here. Bet pot, bet 2/3 pot, bet 1/3 pot, and check. And the solver with Jack-9 is, I guess mostly, not even mostly, you know, it's like, call it 25% of the time with every single option. Again, very, very difficult to implement, very difficult to know you're supposed to be implementing that. But that is the GTO strategy, and what it amounts to is you probably want to be betting this Jack-9 the vast majority of the time. Take a look at some hands that pretty much always bet. Notice 10-9, King-10, Queen-Jack, King-Jack, King-Queen, Notice all these hands are just like, well, a lot of those hands are random overcards, right? So random overcards in this scenario are opting to bluff, which is kind of cool to see. Anyway, Negreanu checks, which, maybe he is randomizing. Maybe he is not aware of the GTO strategy here. Again, you're going to find in these scenarios when you're very deep stacked, all options are available. And this solution actually took me a very long time to run, like 7 hours, because we wanted to make sure we got it right. And also, it just takes forever to come up with these optimal strategies when you're playing very, very deep stacked, because really you have a lot of options available. It's very different than when you're playing 20 big blind poker in a poker tournament where really you only have 1 or 2 viable options in a lot of spots and you're not doing a whole lot of mixing. Here, the solver does do a ton of mixing, and that's what makes deep stacked games difficult, right? So anyway, Negreanu opts to check. Maybe he knows he's supposed to check a lot, maybe he doesn't. Anyway, he does check. POLK then goes for a 2/3 pot bet, which we'll take a look at his strategy here. 8-7 suited. Notice now he's already missing a decent chunk of these, but 8-7 suited, when it does bet, it typically does bet 2/3 pot. That's the most chosen bet size with 8-7 suited. So looks like Doug Polk's playing very, very close to perfect GTO strategy so far. Of course, if you bet bigger, that's fine. If you bet smaller, it's fine. If he checks, it's fine. Again, lots and lots of mixing going on here. And now Negreanu pretty much has to raise, right? He goes for a 4,490 raise, which I believe is about 80% pot, something like that. Is that right? In this scenario, pot is 3K. If he puts another 1,200 in, pot will be 4,000. Basically, so in this scenario, to figure out a pot size raise, Negreanu has to call the 1,200 first. That would make the pot 4,200. So he's making it a little bit less than pot size raise. Yeah, so you take this number minus 1,200, so he's putting 36 on top of 42, so I call it 75% pot, something like that. All right, and in this scenario, we do see Negreanu should be raising the Jack-9 about half the time. This is interesting. Like, I would have presumed, just as a novice heads-up player here, that Jack-9 would be a hand that would want to basically always raise because it's a super nuts and it doesn't really block any of the opponents or much of the opponent's continuing range because they're going to have lots of pairs. But take a look. You're really not doing a ton of raising in this scenario. And I guess that's because in the spot, when POLK bets kind of big on the turn, he's essentially saying, I'm very polarized here. I'm relatively polarized. Let's just confirm that to be true. Let's look at his turn betting range. You see 10, 8, 7, 3, right? So notice he's betting a lot of 10s, which are very good. Betting a lot of 9s, which are draws. Betting some of the 8s that have additional equity, but not even betting all the 8s. Like notice King 8 here checking, Ace 8 checking sometimes, Queen 8 checking, right? So he's betting like a 10 or better to some extent. And then he's betting some bluffs. Notice a lot of Jack X bluffing. So pretty cool to see that, right? So POLK is relatively polarized. Notice checking 65% of the time, right? You're going to find whenever you bet the flop often, you often do a decent amount of checking on the turn. Just because when you bet the flop and get called, your opponent's range loses all their junk, but your range still contains a lot of your junk. So anyway, that's why Negreanu's not actually raising all that often. But typically when you are raising, you want to raise with your absolute best hands that are kind of vulnerable to being outdrawn. And also just some sporadic bluffs. Let's take a look and find some sporadic bluffs here. Well, let's go through the value first. Notice Jack-9 raises. Jack-10 raises every time if he has it. Queen-Jack bluffs. Ace-10 raises for value. Notice Queen-9 opts to bluff a decent chunk of the time, which is a gut shot straight draw to the nuts. 7-3 is a 2-pair hand that raises, sets raise a lot, right? 9-6 and 9-7. So 9-6 is a straight, 9-7 is a pair and a draw. Kind of neat to see the bottom pair and draw opting to bluff a decent chunk of the time. 10-7, 2-pair, right? Opts to raise again. And then you see a lot of random bottom pairs opting to raise as a bluff, like Ace-3. That's kind of neat. Ace-3 and Ace-7, I like to check raise here, which I don't think many people do. So if you're looking for bluffs in this spot, turns out when your opponent takes this polarized strategy, since a 7 loses to the vast majority of their range, it's probably not great to check call with it. I mean, I guess it's fine, but those hands do opt to check raise sometimes. So like notice Ace-3 here actually folds a decent chunk of the time, but it opts to raise. And you're going to find that very often a lot of the bottom pair type hands that need to fold a lot, but still have good equity when they check raise and get called, because if you get an ace or a 3, you're really happy. Those often consider bluffing too. So anyway, back to Doug Polk. And now I want you to take a second here and think about what you would do in this spot. This is a very important spot. It comes up quite often where you bet and you get raised. What would you do in Doug Polk's scenario? Write it in the comments below. Would you fold? It's probably not a good play. Would you call? Or would you re-raise? And if you re-raise, how much are you going to make it? I know here he's against the straight, but he doesn't know he's against the straight, right? Two pairs, usually very, very strong heads up. So whenever you bet the flop and bet the turn and then get raised, are you folding, calling, or re-raising? And if you're re-raising, how much? Type it in the comment section below. I'll wait a second. Okay, you did it. Good. Now, in this scenario, we are going to find that Doug Polk should have almost no re-raising range. This comes up in all forms of no limit hold'em, where when you bet and get raised in a spot where your opponent announces they are very, 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 very polarized, because even if Negreanu's not playing the perfect GTO strategy, he's playing like somewhat close to it. Take a look at these hands that are raising, right? Remember, the hands that are raising here are really good made hands, like two pairs, and then pairs with draws, and some like sporadic gut shots, right? That's a really strong range. And against that really strong range, Doug Polk should have no re-raising range. As we see, the GTO solver here opts to re-raise a whopping 0.43% of the time, which might as well be never. So, Doug Polk should not re-raise here. Notice when Doug Polk has 8-7, he calls every single time. Because if you re-raise here, what happens is Negreanu gets to fold out all of his bluffs that are drawing very thin, and you actually want to keep those in the pot because you want them to be able to bluff the river. And when Negreanu has a premium hand, he's never folding, and you're actually not in all that great shape against the premium hands. Because notice you lose to the sets, you lose to straights. You do beat 7-3 and 8-3, but you lose to 10-7, 10-8, right? So this is a spot where 8-7 is just a very, very pure call. And this is a very, very common spot. When your opponent takes a very polarized line, like when they check call flop, check raise turn, they're saying if they're good, that they're polarized. If they're polarized, you in turn don't get to re-raise, okay? Important point. Anyway, here we go. River is the 8. Negreanu goes for the river bet, which seems reasonable to me. Notice here, the solver actually likes a pot size bet here. We gave it an 80% pot bet and 100% pot bet, as well as an all-in and a small bet. And you see the 100% pot bet is much preferred, 18% of the time. 18% of your range is betting that size compared to 1.87% or 1.78% whenever you're betting slightly smaller. I wanted to show here that Negreanu did not bet pot. He bet 80% pot, right? And what you can do is you can give the solver multiple sizes like this, because we gave it a whole pile of sizes, right? Lots and lots of options. And you're going to find that very often it picks one size way more than the others, or sometimes it'll pick a big size and a small size and not so many medium sizes. And you're going to find that very often in scenarios like this, slightly bigger is often a little bit better. So right here, notice Jack 9, it's either checking every once in a while or betting on the big side like pot. So Daniel Negreanu probably made a little bit of an error here by not betting pot. And you may say that, what's it matter? 80% pot is all the same thing. And to be fair, it is close to the same thing, but it is not the same thing. And right here, imagine he was potting it here, and Doug Polk had a 10 or an 8 that's going to call. He might as well get an extra $2,500, $2,600 in the pot, right? You'd rather get an extra $2,600 than not get it. I know he's beat this time, but this is definitely a spot where he wants to bet on the bigger side. Okay, back to Doug Polk. Seems like an easy all-in to me. Let's see what solver says. As we see, solver's all in. Notice here, solver does not even opt to use any other sizes here. It's either all in or calling. Because remember, Negreanu's very polarized at this point. He either has a really, really good hand or nothing. And when he has a really good hand, he's always going to call the jam. And when he has nothing, he's always going to fold to the jam. So there's no real point in trying to get tricky and putting in a min raise or anything like that. It just doesn't make sense. Also, we saw Negreanu doesn't really check raise a whole lot of 8s on the turn. So he's not going to have a lot of those, right? So you can't say, maybe he has trips and he'll fold to an all in. But if he has trips, he's going to call an all in anyway. So I love Polk's bluff. I'm sorry, his value bet. Let's take a look at some of his bluffs. What should he be bluffing on this board? What would you bluff on this board? Take a second and consider it. You always want to ask yourself these questions when you're analyzing hands, because going through and questioning your assumptions is very important. Because a lot of people in this spot would take a hand like a 9, right? Like pocket 9s and bluff it. Because like, okay, I blocked the straight. Let me check raise pocket 9s. But actually, that's not right here, because in this scenario, you really just want to block the full houses that Negreanu could potentially have that would call your all-in. Because he could have the straight, but he could also have lots of full houses in this scenario. And if you block the full houses, but you can't beat the value betting range here, you should be somewhat inclined to consider turning that hand into a bluff. So the full house blockers are most important. So what's the full house blocker here? A 10, but a 10 can probably just profitably call, or 7 or 3. Does POLK have any hands containing a 7 and a 3? Notice 7-3 here is now just a very bad bluff catcher, right? Take a look at this. The solver opts to use almost entirely 7-3, 10-3 suited, Jack-3 suited if you have it, but mostly 7-3 suited is the main bluffing hand. Okay? Notice Jack-8 elects to raise sometimes. 10-7 is the other two-pair blocker. Notice that also opts to bluff occasionally, but that actually folds if you're just facing a bet. So notice even like 10s are folding sometimes. Of course, Doug POLK doesn't actually have a lot of 10s here. Jack 10 elects to call, right? So you don't need to use Jack 10 as a bluff. So 10-7 considers bluffing. And 8-7's the nuts, right? Pocket 7's the nuts. But 7-3 suited is the main bluff here. So don't take a hand like pocket 9s or even like ace 9 or king 9 and think you need to bluff that. Because you don't need to bluff that. You need to bluff in this scenario on paired boards. Not always, but usually with the two pairs that got counterfeited. Those are often the best bluffing candidates because those block the strongest hands in Negreanu's, well, your opponent's range. Negreanu's not always your opponent. All right, so anyway, in this scenario, sucks for Negreanu. Easy call. This is just a cooler to some extent at this point, right? You can't fold this hand. Interestingly enough, I say you can't fold this hand. Solver folds the Jack 9 about half the time. I would literally never fold here. To be fair, I want to make it clear. The solver assumes we're playing all GTO strategies here, but I think it's pretty clear that Doug POLK perhaps overbluffs a little bit. If you know your opponent likes to overbluff, you certainly don't want to be folding straights here. And the thing is, if your opponent may overbluff, they may also overvalue some hands as well. Meaning, like say Doug POLK has any 8 on this river. He may always check raise it all in. But notice like an 8 for trips on the river. Jack 8 mostly calls. Ace 8 somehow folds sometimes. That's just weird. But anyway, imagine Doug POLK. I'm not saying he does this, but imagine he check raises whatever 8s he has in his range. Or imagine he raises whatever 8s he has in his range. Then certainly you can't fold Jack 9 because you beat all of those. So definitely consider your opponent's strategies here. But we do see Jack 9 actually opts to fold sometimes. Same thing with 9-6 for a straight. And basically everything else folds. Pocket 3s for full house calls. Notice a lot of these other hands are just not in his range. And you may say, like, there's not a whole lot of hands in either player's range on the river. And yeah, and that's because the solver is assuming very, very mixed strategies. Remember, at pretty much every point in this hand, we had a lot of options. And they're all taken some portion of the time, right? And as they are taken some portion of the time, that essentially weeds out portions of Negreanu's range to the point that by the time he gets to the river, he doesn't really have all that many combinations of hands. Same thing for Doug POLK, right? And this is why implementing these GTO strategies are very, very difficult. Anyway, Negreanu calls off here and loses. But I want to make it clear, a lot of people just saw this hand and thought, oh, standard cooler, what are you going to do? And to be fair, Negreanu's going to lose this hand, he's going to get stacked. But he always wants to make sure that he goes about getting stacked in a manner that ideally keeps Doug POLK's range as wide as possible. That said, I think both players played this hand certainly fine. And another giant pot is pushed Doug POLK's direction. So that's going to be it for today. Before we wrap it up, I actually am having the biggest sale of the year that I'm offering. It is at pokercoaching.com/Black Friday. We have lots and lots of my training products on discount, but if I had to recommend one thing to all poker players who are actively looking to improve their skills, check out Poker Coaching Premium. You have a very, very big discount if you sign up for a year at pokercoaching.com/Black Friday. I made Poker Coaching Premium to be the training site I want. I hire the coaches who I want to learn from, who I know are going to help me, already pretty strong player, become even better. We also have lots and lots of beginner content, intermediate content, but for me personally, the high-level content is amazing. Just the other day, we had Giraffe Ganger, one of the absolute best online tournament players in the world. He was #1 in the world recently, reviewing a $10,000 buy-in win. He actually won 2 EPTs online just the other day too, so he's absolutely crushing it. We also had James Romero. He was one of the top 10 live players pre-COVID, and he's reviewing using Pile Solver and Munker Solver, various 3-betting scenarios. So, I mean, we have literally the best players in the world teaching our students and myself And if you want to get great at poker as fast as you can so you don't waste your time studying things that are not relevant to you, check out pokercoaching.com/Black Friday and sign up for Poker Coaching Premium. So yeah, that's me for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, click like, click subscribe. I'd appreciate it. That lets the YouTube robots know that you like me. There's also a notification bell. Click that and you'll be notified whenever I upload a new video. So yeah, have a great day. Enjoy yourselves. Thank you very much again for being here. And I'll talk to you next time.